Julia?
This was 11 degrees this morning.
No? Is that a no?
It snowed last night.
Hey, Bill, turn the volume up a little bit too for me.
Took a week's vacation.
Hey, Bill, can you turn the volume up on that?
You drive or fly? Yeah, good.
Is it turned up all the way?
Where'd you go? Tampa?
How's that? Hey, can you hear me better now?
I've been there twice.
Yeah?
Braden's on the south side of the bay.
What number?
And I had some
Oh,
down to Braden.
the one that's going up and down. One.
The beach at Braden.
Can you see it? It should be.
The best
The green thing should be going up and down, right?
I've ever seen in my life. It was just perfect. I mean, I couldn't believe it.
How's that? Can you hear me better?
Saying my hands,
Okay. Hey, Terry, we're going to get started here.
this is so fine.
Hey, Terry, we're going to get started here. Any questions about last week? We finished up this chiasm, remember? Took a long time to get through, didn't it?
Well, at the end, you said we were going to be finished, and I said, promises, promises.
But we did. Are you proud of me?
We're going to see where you start today.
We're starting at verse 18. It's right up here in the slide. So, can you hit the arrow for me too, Aaron, so I can have control of this? Hey, Aaron, can you hit the arrow for me on the PowerPoint so I can have control? There we go. All right, so we're in this middle section of Amos. He's got a lot going on here. He's got a chiasm, a poem. He's finishing up this judgment and destruction section. Okay, and the way he does it, I lost it again, Aaron. Can you maybe hit the next arrow? Hey, Aaron. For some reason, I still don't have. You know that. That's so. How come I can't do it?
Is it on?
Yeah, I was just using it. Like 5 minutes ago, I was using it. There we go. Did I do that or did you?
No, that's you.
Oh, thank goodness. Wow. So we're at the end of this judgment and destruction section, okay? And at the end of this, how does he wrap it up? Remember how I said? Two woe oracles. It's the section, this middle section of Amos. He wraps it up in the last half of chapter 5 in the first part of chapter 6 with two woe oracles. And the interesting part about this is the first woe oracle, he introduces a concept for us, which is called the day of the Lord. Okay? Now, Amos doesn't begin this concept. He just sort of riffs off of the earlier prophets, the same thing, okay, in the same way that we've been talking about, like with the remnant theme, with the covenant theme, all these other things, okay? It's very typical. It's the same thing, it's just different, okay? Now, chronologically, this is the first time that this phrase appears, the day of the Lord, okay? First time in the Bible, this day of the Lord appears, okay? And he gives it to us 3 times specifically in this first woe oracle. But it's not the first time in the Bible, okay? Isaiah comes before Amos, but remember, chronologically, Amos predates Isaiah. So this is the first time that anybody in the Bible says these words to us, the day of the Lord, okay? So this is sort of a big deal. And Amos has already talked about this twice already in his book. In chapter 4, we talked about this, preparing to meet your God, O Israel, when God comes to you directly and personally. But also in chapter 5 that we just finished up last week, for I will pass through your midst. What is that a reference to? Do you remember that from last week? I will pass through your midst. Do you remember what that is a reference to? Did somebody say Moses? Exodus. Remember? The Passover specifically. Remember how Moses uses 2 words, I will pass, and I will pass? But they're different words, right? They're just translated the same in English. So what one is this? This is the way that God passed through the Egyptians, which is fitting because it is a judgment, okay? This is him passing through. Hey, Ted, can you sit at the computer? Because I'm going to need you to push play in a few minutes. So now he names it. He's already talked about it twice already in his book, but now he gives it a name. This day, this is the day of the Lord. And this is something that the later prophets 8 of them actually pick up and riff off of, right? Isaiah talks about the day of the Lord several times. So does Ezekiel, so does Jeremiah, so does Zechariah, so does Malachi, so does Hosea. A lot of them do, okay? And then the New Testament apostles also talk about this. So we got to understand this, what this means. Remember how we talked about Amos being one of the first of these covenantal lawyers, covenantal lawsuit prophets, right? And the interesting thing about that, him being one of the first, is you see some of these big themes that run through the Bible in their infancy, right? He doesn't create them, but he's one of the first, okay? So when you see them sort of underdeveloped a little bit. He doesn't have all the pieces. He doesn't have all the nuts and bolts. So you see them in their infancy as they're developing, and then as you read through the later prophets, you see them become more and more and more materialized, and the closer you get to Jesus, it's like, well, yeah, obviously this is talking about Jesus because we see a more complete, holistic picture of what the prophets are trying to tell us, but Amos is right at the beginning of these, okay? You could call him the tip of the spear, maybe, if you've heard that before. What else do I want to say about that? We looked at one of these last week. Remember this remnant theme? How the remnant theme is very developed in the New Testament and some of the later prophets. But in Moses, in the Torah, it's not developed. And Amos picks it up and he gives us more and more pieces, right? So from Moses, you've got a very incomplete picture of what the remnant is through Noah, and then later through Joseph and what happened to the remnant of the family being saved through Egypt. But then when we get to Amos, we get more of these pieces. Like the judgment that comes is directly from God, right? And it is directly from the transgression of this covenant. And it's how God saves this remnant due to his promise to humanity from Genesis 3, right? Genesis 3:16, but also Genesis 15, when God cut a covenant with Abraham. How he's going to bring this blessing to humanity. Okay? Well, we sort of come to another one today. This day of the Lord concept. Okay? Now, even though this is the first time in the Bible, chronologically, that this phrase has been given to us, okay, the concept actually goes back to the Exodus story. Okay? So, what is the day of the Lord? What do you think the day of the Lord is, briefly? Because you've all heard of the day of the Lord, right?
Day of judgment.
A day of judgment? Anything? Is it anything else?
Maybe a day when God reveals his pleasure, choices, demands.
Okay.
It's not necessarily bad, but...
Yeah, so that's it. It's not necessarily bad. It's something that's good. Remember, like, what is Nathan's not here. What does what does the beaver say to Lucy in the Chronicles of Narnia? She says that Lucy's asking him about Aslan, the king, like this lion, right? And she says, well, is he good? Or no, is he dangerous? And the beaver's like, well, he's a lion. I'm not talking about danger, I'm talking about good. He's good, right? Yes, he's dangerous, but he's good too, okay? He's good, right? So this day of the Lord, when God comes to dwell directly with his people, with humanity, is that good or bad?
Good.
It depends, doesn't it? It sort of depends on your orientation, right? For Israel in this time, it was not good. And Amos is going to get into that. Actually, he talks about that right in the beginning part of verse 18. It's not good. But for the remnant, it is good. And for the disciples and the followers of Jesus, it is good. For the Israelites in the day of the Exodus, it was good, right? It depends on your orientation, right? So this day of the Lord concept, it's sort of complex, and it develops itself as we go through the biblical narrative, okay? Now this phrase, it symbolizes a day, okay? It usually is an anticipated day when Yahweh comes to redeem his people personally and directly and dwells with his people in an intimate way. Did that ever happen before Amos? It happened in Exodus, didn't it? I remember when it happened a few times actually, but in Exodus, what happens at the very end of Exodus? The Spirit of God goes directly into the tabernacle, right? And then Moses couldn't go in, right? And then at the beginning of Exodus, well, sort of in the middle, he redeemed Israel from bondage, right? And then he saved them directly. And then he led them directly and intimately throughout the wilderness to Mount Sinai, right? So this has already happened. But it's still happening, as Amos points out, because it's something different, okay? You see, in Amos's day, it is the people, the Israelites, who have become the metaphorical Egypt, okay? So now the tables have turned. The roles are different in Amos's day. But this also brings, this is also a day where God brings his recompense and his punishment for the wicked, right? This retributive and this restorative justice that we talked about, this comprehensive justice, or mishpat, that we spent, a few weeks on about a month ago, that Amos has already been talking about extensively, okay? You see, up to now, the Israelites only viewed this day of the Lord, this day of days, as they called it, as a day of restoration for themselves. Amos is now here to say that this day of the Lord is also a day of retribution for the wicked. Okay? Something the Egyptians were already well familiar with, right? This already happened to them and the nations as well. Okay? This is a day of comprehensive justice, or mishpat. So this is a day that you could either look forward to or not look forward to, depending on your orientation. And Amos says right here that for you guys, it's a day of darkness. It's not a day of light, okay? It's as if a man fled from a lion and he was met by a bear, or he went to his house and leaned his hand against a wall and the serpent bit him. This is not good for these people. And it's directly related to their behavior, right? In their treatment of the covenant, which he went through thoroughly in chapters 1 through 4, okay? That's why this is a day of darkness, the day of the Lord, for them, okay? If you go back 600 years, roughly, it was the Egyptians. But now it's the Israelites, okay? This concept is a really big deal that runs the length of the Bible from the Exodus story all the way to Revelation. And it has a huge impact on us, okay? But Amos is one of the first prophets to actually, he's the first prophet to give this day a name, okay? And how I want to start this is actually by a short video. And, oh, cool. Can you hit play on that for me, Aaron? Make sure the volume works.
The day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. It's a phrase in the Bible that religious people use, usually when talking about the end of the world.
Yeah, things like Armageddon or the apocalypse. You might be familiar with this image of Jesus returning on a white horse. He's got a sword to bring final judgment.
And everyone wants to know, how will it all go down?
So a lot of these images come from the last book of the Bible, but to understand them, you have to go back to the first book.
When the story begins, we watch God create an amazing world, and then he gives humans power to rule over it on his behalf.
But the humans are tempted by this mysterious, unhuman character who offers them a promise. You could define good and evil on your own terms and put yourselves in God's place.
Which is what they do. And the resulting stories are about the broken relationships and violence that results.
Yeah, this promise creates huge problems. Now everyone has to protect themselves and fight for survival, and they're all using death as this weapon to gain power.
It all leads to a story about the building of the city of Babylon.
Or in Hebrew, Babel. Everyone comes together to elevate themselves to the place of God. And God knows how devastating this could be. A whole culture redefining good and evil as if they are God.
So God confuses their language and scatters them.
Now from here on, Babylon becomes like an icon in the biblical story. It's an image that represents humanity's corporate rebellion against God.
And the next time we see it is in the story of ancient Egypt.
Yeah, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he feels threatened by these immigrant Israelites. He starts killing all of the boys, enslaving the rest.
And this is really evil.
Yeah, Egypt's like this bigger, badder Babylon. They take care of themselves at the expense of others by redefining evil as good. And so God turns Pharaoh's evil back on him. His pride drives him forward, and he's swallowed up by death.
Now, after this great deliverance, the Israelites sing a song about how God is their warrior who liberated them from evil.
And the Israelites referred to this moment as the day.
The day they were rescued from a corrupt human system.
And every year since then, the Israelites have celebrated the day of their liberation with this symbolic meal of a sacrificial lamb that's called Passover.
Eventually, Israel comes into its own land, have their own kings, and they face new enemies.
So that past day of the Lord, celebrated every Passover, begins to generate hope that God will bring the day again to save Israel from new threats.
Now, out in the hills was a sheep herder named Amos.
He was appointed by God as a prophet to announce shocking news to Israel, that God was bringing another day of the Lord against his enemies, and this time the target is Israel.
What?
Sadly, Israel's leaders had also redefined good and evil for themselves, resulting in corruption and violence.
God's people have become like Babylon. The oppressed become oppressors. Babylon seems like a trap no one can escape.
And so the day of the Lord comes upon Israel. They're conquered, taken captive into exile, and from then on, Israel suffered under the rule of continuous oppressive empires.
This is the story Jesus was born into.
Yeah, in his day, the oppressive empire over Israel is Rome.
So, is Jesus going to confront Rome, take him out?
Well, no. Jesus saw the real enemy as that mysterious, unhuman evil. The evil that's lured Babylon, Egypt, Rome, Israel, all humanity has given in to evil's promise of power. This is what Jesus resisted alone in the wilderness when he was tempted to exploit his power for self-interest.
But he didn't. And after that, he started to confront the effects of evil on others.
Yeah, he started saying that he was going to Jerusalem for Passover for a final showdown to confront the evil of Israel and Rome by dying.
Dying? I mean, that feels like losing.
Jesus was going to let evil exhaust all of its power on him, using its only real weapon, death. Jesus knew that God's love and life were even more powerful, that he could overcome evil by becoming the Passover lamb, giving his life in an act of love. And something changed that day. When Jesus defeated evil, he opened up a new way for anyone to escape from Babylon and discover this new kind of power, this new way of being human.
Okay, so something changed.
the fire.
But
That
the
fire's
power of
symbolic.
evil is still alive and well, and we keep building new versions of Babylon.
Right. And so the last book of the Bible, the Revelation, points to the future and final day of the Lord. It's when God's kingdom comes to confront Babylon the Great, this image of all the corrupt nations of the world.
Yeah, this is it. Armageddon, final judgment. How is Jesus gonna finish off evil?
Well, that's not how you'd expect. In the Revelation, the victorious Jesus is symbolized by a sacrificial bloody lamb. And then when Jesus does arrive in the end, riding his white horse to confront evil, he's bloody before the battle even starts.
Pre-bloodied? That's a strange image.
Yeah, it's because Jesus isn't out for our blood. Rather, he overcame with his blood when he died for his enemies. And the sword is in his mouth. It's a symbol of Jesus' authority to define good and evil and hold us accountable when he brings final justice once and for all.
And so, in the meantime, the day of the Lord is an invitation to resist the culture of Babylon.
And it's a promise that God will one day free our world from corruption and bring about the new things that he has in store.
Thanks for watching.
Okay. Do you think that was helpful? Do you see how that's a little bit different way to view this day of the Lord rather than just isolation? If we read the book of Amos and it's like, oh, the day of the Lord, and we just look at the day of the Lord in the book of Amos, you're going to get a very narrow view of that. And Amos is clearly not writing his book in isolation. I hope I've sort of detailed that thus far. He's writing in the context of the biblical narrative, specifically in Moses, but some of the other prophets that come later as well. He's riffing off of all of them. Okay, so if you look at these days, like remember last week we talked about the day or the death out of Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. And some people just look at that with blinders on, and it's like, well, it means this, it means that, and they try to prove a bunch of other things through that interpretation. But I think the correct way to interpret that is to look at the Bible holistically, and what does that mean holistically, right? Genesis 3 is not telling us when the animals die for the transgression of the humans. Genesis 3 is not telling us anything about 19th century philosophy or whatever we want to impose on the scriptures. It's telling us something about justification and propitiation and penal substitutionary atonement. Just like Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, right? And the innocent son of David in 2 Samuel. Okay? That's what it's looking at. So when I say the day of the Lord, don't think just a day of judgment. Don't think just a day of redemption. Don't think of, well, it's obviously when Jesus returns, like we get when in 2 Thessalonians. It's a lot, okay? What the Bible is doing, what the prophets are doing, is they're taking us and they're leading us to a conclusion of the way God is going to save his people in the future and bring this restoration and restoration of all things, reuniting heaven and earth. But it's based off of how he's done it in the past, okay? How he's done it in the past and how he's going to continue to do it in the future, okay? We don't serve a God of the past or a God of the future. That's what the word I am means. Eternal, past, present, future, always, right? So that's how we sort of need to look at this. And I think the helpful way to do this is to look at just not all of the places, but how this Day of the Lord concept transcends through the Scriptures in sort of a narrative form. And that's how I sort of want to start here. Let me see if I missed anything there. Any questions about that or the video or anything up until this point? Go ahead. Oh, thanks. If you like that, the Bible reading that we're doing right now has these Bible Project videos built into them to sort of give us an understanding of the books as we go through, and that's the production that we've been using.
Can I make a comment here?
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
You talked about how the day of the Lord can be a bad day, but it can be a good day too.
Right.
I went on down to Acts 2 where Peter quotes Joel.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm going to get there. Go ahead, though.
Well, in Acts 2:20, he's quoting Joel, and he talks about the coming of the day of the Lord.
Yep.
And that's a reference by Peter to the day of Pentecost.
Yep. So in the day of the Lord,
it's a good thing.
Yes, but in the day in the day of Pentecost, when Peter gave that first sermon, what was the day of the Lord? What did Peter say Joel was saying the day of the Lord was? The coming of the Holy Spirit. The coming of the Holy Spirit.
Coming and any involving
yes.
Day of Pentecost, the coming of the Holy
the gift of the Comforter. That's what Peter is saying.
After verse 20, it shall be that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved.
So that's
which is saying a different way of salvation from what the Jews
yes.
said about the Old Testament.
But it's not just that.
Yeah, I agree.
It's more. So yeah, that's great. So the best way to understand this, I think, instead of looking at these individually, is to look at them sort of collectively. And I divided these into three parts. Okay, pre-exile and inter-exile, and then post-exile, and then New Testament. Okay, so Isaiah was almost a contemporary with Amos. He came about a generation after Amos. And what does this sound reminiscent of? For the Lord of hosts has a day against all the proud and lofty, against all that has lifted up, and it shall be brought low. What does that sound like? It sounds like two things, doesn't it? It sounds like the day of the exile, when Pharaoh and Egypt have built themselves up and they were brought low. But it also sounds like the people of Amos's day, specifically the northern tribes, Israel, and what's going to happen to Judah here, doesn't it? They have built themselves up. They have, not relied on God. They've relied on themselves. And that's what the day of the Lord is going to be, when those proud become low, and the weak and the humble become high. Go ahead.
It's also like the Pharisees and Sadducees in Jesus'
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
You know, that
It's
the whole thing's going through this.
that is a that's a whole thing. Yeah, that's a whole thing, isn't it? But yes, absolutely. So, I mean, that's also reminiscent of Babel, right? In Genesis, and then Egypt and Pharaoh specifically. But how about the kings of the East in Abraham's day? Who were they brought low by? The kings of the East. God's messenger. Yeah, Abraham, right? You see this everywhere. But now it's the covenantal people of God who have become the figurative seed of the serpent. They have become this thing by their actions that Amos was talking about in chapters 1 through 4. And look what he says just before this. Why did he reject his people? What's underlined? Because of their deeds. Because they are full of the things of the East. What is the direction of the East? It's the direction of man, right? That's where Cain went to, right? That's where they went into exile into, right? The East is the direction of man. It's the direction of wickedness and transgression. They've become consumed with the things of these. And then he just outlines them. Paganism, and he goes on, oppression, all sorts of things, idolatry. So that's why, because of their deeds. And then later on, he further materializes this day of the Lord as destruction and agony and anguish, right? The same way that Amos does it. I think that he's sort of riffing off of Amos here. To them, it's the same because they're living in sort of the same time period as one another, and the people of Israel are just doing the same things over and over again. Okay, now Obadiah. This is sort of debated. Not everybody knows when Obadiah lived exactly, but it looks like the most reasonable estimation is between the destruction of Samaria and Jerusalem. Obadiah doesn't tell us exactly what year he writes, and it's somewhat up for debate, but it's possibly after the destruction of Jerusalem, but most likely in between the two. But he does the same thing with this concept, doesn't he? Now, what are lines 2 and 3 reminiscent of? As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. What does that sound like? Do I have it up here? Oh, I guess sorry. There's a place. It's Egypt, isn't it? Yeah, great. So, I thought I had the passage from Exodus, but what that's referring to is the Egyptians and Pharaoh. What did Pharaoh do? Like, what was his big offense? Remember? He oppressed the Israelites. How did he do that specifically? Slavery, but do you remember what he used? What medium he used? How did he deal shrewdly with the Israelites? I think in chapter 1. He threw the babies in the water, right? The males, right? The males specifically. Then I don't know if it says specifically the firstborn males, but he threw as a form of population control, right?
Not just that, but by doing that, he threatened the entire lineage of the Jews.
Exactly, yeah. So he used water to kill, right? And then God uses water. How does he use water on his people? Salvation, right? I don't care if you're talking about the Red Sea or baptism, all right? But and then there's a bunch of places in between those 2 points, okay, where you can see water. Like the prophets talk about it all the time. Isaiah, like God in Ezekiel, pouring water out on the dry land where there's no life and it's just an inhospitable environment for life. But then God pours water out, but he pours his Spirit out too. And then what happens? Life shoots up all over the place. You see it in Isaiah, but you see it in Ezekiel, the end of Ezekiel too, a big time, right? So, and then there's a point in Exodus, I don't remember where it is, but where Pharaoh has his deeds poured out onto him. What happened to Pharaoh? What happened to his son? Well, I don't know. What happened to his son? His son died, right? He used water to kill the seed of God's people. So his son died, and then what happened to his army? It was crushed in the Red Sea. Yeah. So you see how that's like the opposite? That's pretty cool, isn't it? Maybe I think it's more cool than what it is. I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing that Moses does that in Exodus, but I think it's even more cool that you got a half dozen prophets talking about it in different ways that are all super cool. Okay? So that's Obadiah, right? How does Ezekiel? And Ezekiel is post-exile, sort of. He's sort of getting into a wishy-washy period of time here. He's talking about these bad shepherds, right? Because Ezekiel writes before the full destruction of Jerusalem, right? He goes away with the first exiles, right, with Daniel. But then he's also writing when Jerusalem was devastated in, what was it, 586, right? So he's writing that time period. Says the same thing, bring their deeds upon their heads, right? I don't know Moses and Pharaoh. But he's also talking about the bad shepherds, isn't he? He's talking about these guys as well, right? It's the same thing. It's just this thing that has materialized and has been materializing throughout the prophets of the Old Testament. And then when we get to Jesus, we got all these pieces, and we got to put them together. And when we put them together, it's just beautiful and it's amazing. So Ezekiel here he's riffing off of Moses and Pharaoh, but he's talking about this new concept in these shepherds and these bad shepherds, the foolish prophets who are not doing what they ought to do out of Genesis 15 and 18, being a blessing to the nations and being a nation of priests and all of that. He's riffing off of all of that, and instead of speaking for God, these bad prophets, these bad shepherds, they speak for themselves and they take care of themselves and they oppress the poor, the widows, the sojourners, the immigrants, the fatherless, right? That's what they do. They do the opposite. And later on he talks about how this is a day of doom and it will be visited on the nations as well, right? Very similar to the way Amos uses this. Right? They're not contemporaries, but they're sort of close. Now, when we get into the prophets after the exile, it's also just really cool. You see how Moses gives us something about the day of the Lord, this day where God dwells with his people intimately and directly, and he leads them in the wilderness with a pillar of fire and a cloud. And he gives this retributive justice on their oppressors, but he restores them and gives them a land and takes care of them and shows them his loving kindness and his everlasting love and all this cool stuff. But then when we get to Amos, he gives us a little bit more, right? He's like, it's not just about the ethnic people. It's about the people of God throughout history and throughout humanity. And it's about this blessing to all nations, okay? It starts out as something through Moses, but then the later prophets riff off of it and say, well, it's not just that, it's a bunch of other things, okay? It's something that gets developed, okay? And that's what Joel's doing. So Amos is the first one to sort of take this concept of the day of the Lord and say, look, it's not just this, it's something else. And then we get to Joel and these post-exile prophets, and it's like, it's not just Moses and Amos, it's both of those things too, but there's more, okay? There's more. Joel points to a future day, right? He points to a future day, a time when God will defeat evil and save not just the ethnic people, but the world, okay? And this is where Peter quotes Joel in Acts chapter 2. But we're not there yet, okay? I want to sort of camp out at Joel for a while because he's probably the first one. There's some debate on the dating of Joel. Some people think it was pre-exile, some people think it was post and during. I think the most common sense approach to Joel is that he was post-exile. Because if you look at his book, there's only 3 chapters there, and the way he quotes the pre-exile and the inter-exile prophets it looks like he's quoting them directly. And his book is filled with quotes from Amos, from Isaiah, from 1st and 2nd Kings, from a bunch of other places. And it looks like they're direct quotes. And I think that's the most reasonable approach. Plus also, more importantly, what we're talking about is the way he talks about this day of the Lord. Okay? But remember how this is an evolving concept throughout the Scriptures. Redeeming the covenant people out of Egypt directly and personally, and then bringing judgment to his own people when they have become this figurative seed of the serpent, or the daughters of men, the kings of the east, the people of Babel, the Egyptians, all of these types, okay? And that's exactly the concept that Joel uses when discussing the Day of the Lord theme. Now, post-exile, it becomes something a little bit more, like I just said. You see how the Bible's telling us the same story over and over and over again? But every time it tells us a story, it gives us something new. It just gives us more pieces, okay? It brings us a little bit closer to this understanding of what God's going to do in the future and how God saves us through his Son, okay? So when Jesus comes, we should have a pretty good idea what's going on. But once we get to the post-exile prophets, we need to take a little bit of pause. And that's what I want to sort of do here at Joel. Because he's not the first person to use this ancient symbol of the day of the Lord, but he gives us an extra piece of the puzzle that leads us to Jesus. And it's clear, reading through Joel, I think that it's clear that he's talking about Jesus and he's talking about the Holy Spirit. And I think it's clear from Peter, the way Paul is talking about this concept from Joel and the other prophets in the day of Pentecost on Acts chapter 2. You see, if you just read Amos in the day of the Lord and try to get that out of the book of Amos, you're going to think, out of Exodus, you're going to think, well, obviously the Israelites are the good guys and the Egyptians are the bad guys, right? But it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all. But I'll tell you, a lot of people, even today, want to interpret it that way. You say, well, obviously, anybody who goes to church is a good guy. Anybody who doesn't go to church is a bad guy. And it's not that simple, okay? So, there's three fascinating things about Joel that sort of make him somewhat unique among the prophets initially here. It's not clear when he was writing, but it's, like I said, it sort of looks like he was writing post-exile, and he's riffing off of all these other prophets. Most likely the Second Temple period, okay? Because he talks about the temple, but he doesn't talk about a king, all right? So when was the return of the exile? Ezra and Nehemiah, somewhere around there, and then they rebuilt the temple. Probably right around there. That's sort of what it looks like when he's writing. Also, he uses very familiar scriptures, and multiple of prophets quoting them or alluding to them dozens of times. Lastly, I already said that. A main focus of Joel is this day of the Lord, which is a key theme carried throughout more than a half dozen of the prophets. I think 8 of them talk about the day of the Lord directly. So he describes events in the past when God appears in a powerful way to save, to redeem his people, and to confront evil in a direct way, right? Like the Exodus, but like many of other times. But it begins in the Exodus. That's where it starts. Thus bringing salvation to the whole world. In other words, a blessing to all nations, a blessing to all people groups, right? And all ethnicities that we see in the last chapter of Matthew, right? It's the same concept, Matthew 24, taking the word and the gospel to all nations and all people groups. Now in chapter 1 of Joel, he talks about this past day of the Lord. And you know that it's a past day because he directly roots it in the Torah and the Exodus directly. And he does so in covenantal language. I didn't put this on here, but in chapters 3 and 4, he says, "Hear this, you elders, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days, or in the days of your fathers? Tell the children, like in the days of your fathers, right, your ancestors. He's talking about Exodus, I think, because he goes on to say, tell your children of it. Tell your children to tell their children and their children to another generation. So that is a line that's repeated throughout Deuteronomy, this concept of telling the story of God's people over and over again to each generation, right? It's talked about in the Shema, but it's talked about in about a half dozen times in Deuteronomy. So he starts off by rooting this in this past day of the Lord. And he reminds them of the Exodus, and he uses things like locusts and flies and things that were very familiar throughout the Exodus story. This leads the people and Joel to repentance, okay? And then in chapter 2, he announces another day of the Lord. But now it's a future day, not a past day. And here, the Lord's armies are executing his judgment, and nothing can escape, right? Then he uses imagery that we see in the crucifixion of Jesus, right? Earthquakes, the darkening of the sun and the stars, right? We see this in the crucifixion of Jesus. So I think that's what he's pointing to, this future day of the Lord, okay, that the apostles talk about. Now, Joel gives a two-part response to all of this coming day of the Lord, right? His two-part response is here. First, rend your hearts, not your garments, okay? Why? And then he gives the why on why. Because God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That's also a direct quote from Exodus, okay, when God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai. All right? Now, God's response to this is three parts. In verse 18, I don't have it up here, sorry. But in verse 18 of chapter 2, his response is that he will remove evil from the east to the west. He will restore the land by sending water and causing life to come. And he will personally dwell with his people in verse 27, okay? That's God's response to the rending of your hearts and him being merciful and gracious in the day of the Lord, this coming day of the Lord. Now, Joel addresses these responses all in terms of a future day of the Lord in more depth in the last section, this last chapter of the book. But to save on time, I'm just going to talk about the last three lines here, okay? I'm almost done. I'm going to stop when we get to when we get after Joel here. I'm almost done here. So evil will be destroyed. So let's just read these last three. Oh, wait, hold on a second. Do I even have it? Oh, wait. The last three verses. Egypt shall become a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness, for the violence done to the people of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem to all generations. I will avenge their blood. Blood I have not avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So, Egypt and Edom are often used as types of the seeds of the serpent, okay? Sometimes they're used as Gentiles, but a lot of times seeds of the serpent, okay? These evil, wicked, rebellious people towards God, all right? Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Think about that. Esau is Edom, okay? God's kingdom will be established forever in verse 20, right? So God will destroy evil. He will establish his kingdom forever. And the third thing is God will dwell with his people directly. We see this in verse 21. He will dwell directly. And remember Zion? What is Zion a symbol for? You remember? What is Zion?
It's a hill in Jerusalem.
Yeah. What hill is it?
You mean where the temple is?
Nope. That's Moriah. Remember?
Okay.
Zion was the house of David. Zion was the hill where the people of God, David and his family, David dwelled, right? So instead of being on Mount Moriah, he's going to Zion, right? Remember, in the day in the physical Jerusalem, there's this chasm, there's this saddle, this cut between Zion and Moriah that physically separates. And it used to be really big, right? But they filled it in. And there used to be this giant separation between Zion and Moriah, the place where David dwelled and the place where God inhabited, right? In the temple and the tabernacle in David's day, but later in Solomon's day in the temple, right? But God's coming over. And that's what this future day of the Lord is about, when God comes over to his people directly and personally, right? He's not going to be secluded in the temple forever, right? He's going to restore all things. He's going to come back to Eden, right? To Zion. He's going to come back to his people. And that's what Joel's talking about. He's talking about this day of the Lord that Peter's talking about in Acts chapter 2, when God comes back to us directly so we can dwell with him. And we can have him in the form of the Comforter, the Holy Spirit. That's specifically what Peter was talking about in Acts chapter 2. I was sort of hoping to get through the Old Testament, but I'm going to have to stop. The last thing I want to talk about is Zechariah and Malachi, but I'll finish that up next week. Any questions about any of this?